So good morning to everybody. We are broadcasting now. It is my greatest pleasure, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome you all. My name is Mauro Miedico. I am Deputy Director at the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism. And it's really with greatest pleasure that I welcome all of you to this opening session of this international expert group meeting on vulnerable targets and unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS. And we have devoted this third expert group meeting to the use of UAS or drones by terrorist organizations in the way they do more and more frequently now, either to gather intelligence or to undertake surveillance or to commit attacks, and especially against a vulnerable target or soft target or also critical infrastructure. And this is clearly a threat that has been increasing significantly over the past years, including as drones become cheaper and easier to buy and to operate. But on the other side, drones and UAS have become also increasingly an important tool for law enforcement agencies and other security apparatus across the world to prevent and eventually respond to those attacks. And that's why after the first two expert group meetings that were devoted specifically to the protection of religious sites, the first one, and then to the protection of urban areas, the second meeting, we have decided to devote this third expert meeting, welcoming the 200 representatives from across the world, member states, international, regional organizations, private sector, academia, and civil society, precisely to identify and gather good practices, exchange them, including on the challenges that you have been facing or that you are facing, but also the opportunities that UAS can bring to the realm of vulnerable target protection. What is the aim of this expert group meeting and those that we have already convened? Well, we want to compile good practices, case studies, and tools on these topics, which are being already included in modular guides that we are developing together with our partners at the UN on vulnerable target protection. And we intend to release these tools by the end of the year, including in our new online repository of good practices, which will be launched very soon through our Connect and Learn platform. Therefore, it is very important for us that you participate actively and we exchange knowledge and experience. It is really a greatest pleasure to see so many of you connected from practically around the world, including when it is evening or late evening at time. And I'm most honored to welcome to this opening session Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov and Excellency Sheikh Ali Ahmed bin Saif Al Thani, who is the permanent representative of Qatar to the United Nations. Without any further ado, I would therefore like to invite Under Secretary General Ambassador Vladimir Ivanovich Voronkov to take the floor. You have the screen, Under Secretary General.
Thank you, dear Mauro. Good morning, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Your Excellency Sheikh Ali Ahmed bin Saif Al Thani, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you to the third International Expert Group meeting on the protection of vulnerable targets. Protecting vulnerable targets, including soft targets and critical infrastructure, has become one of the top priorities of our global counter-terrorism agenda. After the first meeting on the protection of religious sites that we held in January, and the second meeting focused on urban centers and touristic venues in June. This third expert group meeting will address the threat that the terrorist use of unmanned aircraft systems represents against vulnerable targets, as well as the opportunities that UAS technology. I'm very pleased to share this opening session with Ambassador Al-Thani. The state of Qatar is the main contributor to our global program on protection of vulnerable targets, and I sincerely appreciate this support. I would like to mention that not only this program is financed by the state of Qatar, and I'm grateful for the general contribution of Qatar to the budget of the Office of Counter-Terrorism. Commonly known as drones, unmanned aircraft systems have already been employed by terrorists to gather information, conduct surveillance and reconnaissance, and carry out attacks by discharging explosive devices. By using drones to film their attacks in conflict zones, Daesh has sought to maximize the media impact of its actions. It can't be excluded that returning foreign terrorist fighters may apply the know-how acquired on the battlefield and seek to turn drones against civilian targets, including open-air crowded places. As the technology and know-how to build UAS becomes more widely available and easy to purchase around the world, their use for terrorist purposes is likely to grow. Future scenarios include the potential threat of drone swarms, whereby one single operator controls multiple drones at the same time, or the routine employment of drones equipped with autonomous navigation features that do not emit any radio signal and are thus more challenging to identify and disrupt. On the flip side, technological advances are making counter-UAS solutions more efficient and precise in their ability to detect and disable hostile drones. When they are employed by authorized law enforcement and other competent authorities, UAS can themselves be critical tool to protect crowded spaces, areas adjacent to major events and tourists' locations. They can enhance prevention, for example, by providing real-time information to accurately assess risks, or help to effectively manage crisis situations, such as coordinating evacuations and supporting the work of first responders. For the next 2 days, this expert group meeting will tackle these two different dimensions, negative and positive, of the use of UAS technology in the context of vulnerable targets. The protection of human rights, a fundamental consideration in this area, will also be a cross-cutting topic in the different sessions of today's discussions. I would like to sincerely thank Ms. Fianola Iolan, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, for opening our session on case studies today. I am sure her participation will highly contribute to our discussions. I am pleased to see the response that convening of this meeting has triggered, drawing international experts of different disciplines from the public and private sector, academia, civil society organizations, and even sport federations. I hope this will also become a good opportunity to expand collaboration and learn from each other. As the General Assembly made clear in the recent review of the global counter-terrorist strategy, only through national, regional, and international partnerships with public and private stakeholders will member states be able to succeed in effectively preventing and responding to terrorist attacks against vulnerable targets. The need to team up and build public-private confidence is even more important when we consider the role of unmanned aircraft systems in this context. It will therefore come as no surprise that forging strong, innovative, and multi-stakeholder partnerships is one of the main objectives of our global program on the protection of vulnerable targets and of our global programs on unmanned aircraft systems and sport and security, which are also co-hosting this meeting. The Vulnerable Targets Program, which was launched in response to the calls of the General Assembly and the Security Council, including its Counter-Terrorism Committee, first, provides to requesting member states specialized technical assistance and capacity building to prevent, protect, mitigate, investigate, respond to, and recover from terrorist attacks against vulnerable targets. And two, identifies and shares relevant good practices from around the world through the tailored knowledge products, such as modular guides. This program is implemented in partnership with relevant United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact entities, namely the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and in collaboration with Interpol and other international and regional organizations. I would like to thank these entities for their dedication to our common efforts. Let me wish you a very productive meeting, invite you to share your good practices and experiences, and thank you for your engagement, for your support, for your work to prevent and counter terrorism. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Franco, for your words, and you're welcome to all participants. And it is now my greatest honor to invite Excellency Sheikh Ali Ahmed bin Saif Al Thani, who is the permanent representative of Qatar to the United Nations, to deliver remarks. And once more, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, for your greatest support. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mario, and of course, Undersecretary General Vladimir Voronkov, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored, of course, of the opportunity to once again join USG Vladimir Voronkov in opening another exceptional UNOCT event, which brings together different stakeholders to have a timely discussion of an important issue in the field of counterterrorism. Dear colleagues, critical infrastructure, open public spaces, and other so-called soft targets are uniquely vulnerable to terrorist attacks and deserve continued efforts to mitigate all sorts of risks. In this field, international cooperation and partnerships among a wide range of actors are needed. For its part, the State of Qatar has taken this matter into consideration within the framework of its partnership with international partners such as UNOCT and Interpol. It has developed expertise and capabilities in this field, and it is ready to contribute to enhancing international cooperation and capacity building to counter terrorist acts against vulnerable targets. The United Nations, in specific, the UNOCT, has an important role to play in coordinating efforts to protect vulnerable targets, identify best practices and gaps, and support capacity building. In this context comes UNOCT's global program on countering terrorist threats against vulnerable targets, which was launched, of course, earlier this year, and for which the State of Qatar is proud to contribute funding as part of its commitment to support UNOCT's strategic priorities and robust partnership with the other implementing partners, including UNOCT, CTED, UNAOC, UNCRE, and of course, Interpol. We are glad to see this new and timely program taking concrete steps to deliver on its mission, including by convening this meeting. Dear colleagues, to effectively take necessary preventive and protective measures in connection with vulnerable targets, there is a need to better understand the various and new threats against them, including, of course, unmanned aerial systems, which is called UAC. This technology offers a means to gather intelligence, conduct surveillance, and as well as carry out attacks. As expected, terrorists have wasted no time in exploiting these opportunities to carry out their irresponsible agendas, as they have with other new technologies. But although UAS technology is relatively new, it has proven accessible to actors with limited resources, which makes it especially dangerous. The open nature of so-called soft targets is cause for special concern in this regard, as it makes them prime targets. Therefore, there is a need for a specific measures to protect them and to anticipate the misuse of drones by terrorist groups. But while UAS can be a threat in the wrong hands, this versatile technology can be harnessed by member states and the United Nations in the context of security as a useful addition to the CT toolkit. This includes intelligence, surveillance, border security and management, and protection of vulnerable targets. To that end, we are confident that the sessions today and tomorrow would contribute to protection against the threat posed by UAS, both through discussions of policy frameworks and discussions of practical approaches to prevention, preparedness, and response. I wish the participants in this expert meeting all the success, and we look forward to their outcomes. And I thank you again.
Many thanks, Your Excellency, Madam Ambassador, for these very insightful remarks, but also for your strong personal support to the work of our office, and of course for the State of Qatar's commitment to strengthening international cooperation on counter-terrorism. I would like to thank then both you, Madam Ambassador, and Under Secretary General Voronkov once again for introducing this expert meeting and for recalling also how drones and UAS can be an important tool for law enforcement and security apparatus, provided they are used in compliance with the rule of law and human rights and other international standards. Let me therefore thank you both again, and I would like now to transition to the first of our session. Before doing that, I would like to remind everybody that we have interpretation in all the 6 languages of the United Nations, and you can pick and choose your language easily on the platform under the interpretation icon. It is now, therefore, my pleasure to invite our dear colleague and friend, Jean-Philippe Morange, Senior Legal Officer at the Counter-Terrorism Executive Committee Director, who will be moderating the first session. Jean-Philippe, may I ask you to please turn on your camera and take your moderation role, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauro. Good morning, Excellence. Good morning, Mr. Voronkov, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. It's also a pleasure because this topic is a topic that we have shared with you for years. We started to work with Interpol, with ICAO, and it's great to see this initiative. So it's my pleasure to thank UnoCity for inviting us, for launching that, and of course to thank Qatar to support that for the benefits of member states. It has been an emerging and evolving topic in the agenda of the CTC and CTED. It's a concern for a lot of member states, and to see the use of US for terrorist purpose. The question of also the use of security by security and law enforcement agencies, you covered that also in the introductory remark, is a growing source of concern, and it requires oversight mechanism in a lot of cases. We are going to speak about that for sure. CTED then is very happy with other Global Compact entity to work with this UNOCT program. And we are glad to see a kind of integration of Security Council resolution into that. Of course, Resolution 2309, and Sylvain will cover from ICAO perspective this important element. Resolution 2341 regarding critical infrastructures, and we have started to work together on that already. 2370 on the small arms, and of course, preventing access to access to US by terrorists. Resolution 2396, clearly referring to that. So I think this initiative is great, respond to and align its outcome with the recommendation of CTC and CTED. And more during our assessment, we have this dialogue, being in a context of course, pure US, vulnerable target, even the concept of smart city. And I can remember some discussion with some member states about that. So it's a very important discussion. And in that regard, the development of the guideline that we are also doing within the framework of the Global Compact Border Management Law Enforcement Working Group will bring additional guidance material for the benefits of member states. And I really want to underline that because it's a submodule. This guideline includes a submodule on US. So after this kind of preliminary remark, and please apologize for that, but I think it was important to recall this framework. It's my pleasure to welcome a great panel of experts, and I will definitely encourage everybody to listen, of course, their comments, and also to engage in the Q&A session at the end. So in that context, and with your permission, Mauro, I would like to introduce Matthew Cox. Matthew is Head of Domestic Aircraft Security and Counter Drones at the UK Department of Transport. Matthew is working on counter-terrorism and the use of US at airports. So I think it's a very precise and interesting topic from the field. And Matthew sits at the Domestic Aviation Security Team. He works closely with the variety of cross-government partners with an interest in US. So we have this opportunity to hear directly from experience from member states. So Matthew, if you're ready to take the floor, I'm happy to handle the floor to you. Matthew.
Hello. Thank you, Jean-Philippe, and thank you, Under Secretary General and Your Excellencies, for your opening remarks. I'm just going to try to share my screen with you all. Are you able to see this?
Perfectly.
Excellent. So as mentioned, I'm Matthew Cox and Head of Domestic Aircraft Security and Counter Drones in the UK government. I'm also fortunate to be accompanied by Richard Rose, Head of Domestic Aviation Security. I'll be speaking about the UK's approach to drones and specifically drone incursions at airports. So I'll refer interchangeably between US and drones, as has already been remarked upon. I'll first talk about the threat to airports and then the UK's mitigations. So in terms of the threat, well, the first thing that people think of with drones in airports is Gatwick 2018, which you may remember. The drone disruption to UK airports over the 2018 Christmas period was a wake-up call for the UK and the rest of the world over how significant the impact of malicious drone use can be. Hundreds of thousands of people had their travel disrupted, with tens of millions of pounds of economic damage. In the UK, this has served as a catalyst for action. That said, while Gatwick remains forefront of people's minds, I do want to take a step back. The UK perceives the threat from drones, both to airports and beyond, to be much broader than what occurred in 2018. For example, and as you can see on the slides, reckless and negligent uses and incidents, the use in and for criminality, and of course the terrorist use of drones, both overseas and in the UK. Airports are attractive targets for terrorists and those involved in serious and organised crime because of their high profile and iconic nature. and an attack or malicious and disruptive use can all have serious safety, security, and economic consequences, as you'll all be aware. So next I'm going to turn to what have the UK done to mitigate against this. So we have responded with a comprehensive and layered approach, blending technological innovation, legislation, regulation, and education. So first, I'll talk about a strategy published by the Home Office and the Department for Transport in the UK government. And this strategy is a UK counter-unmanned aircraft strategy, which sets out our approach. This includes developing a comprehensive understanding of the evolving risks posed by the illegal use of drones, taking a full spectrum approach to deter, detect, and disrupt the misuse of drones, building strong relationships with industry to make sure their products meet the highest security standards, and crucially, empowering the police and other operational responders through access to counter-drone capabilities and effective legislation, training, and guidance. Through this, we've reduced the vulnerability of sensitive sites, specifically airports, to drone incursions. So just to provide a little bit more colour on what I've spoken about, we have developed guidance airports on how to assess drone risks and vulnerabilities and on counter-drone technology. We've standardised signage to clearly designate areas where drone flights are prohibited, as well as providing information to the public on how to report drone sightings. We have set security requirements for manufacturers and end users of counter-drone equipment and provided opportunities for vendors of counter-drone equipment to safely test and refine their equipment. We have expanded no-fly zones around airports from 1 kilometre to 5 kilometres since 2019. And finally, we work, as I've mentioned, very closely with industry. So many commercially available drones already include geofencing capabilities. This is software that can restrict a drone from flying in certain areas, like airports. The government is engaging directly with drone manufacturers and industry on how we can improve these. We're working with airspace managers and regulators to understand how best robust data on these airspace restrictions and those around airports and other critical national infrastructure sites can be made available in a format that manufacturers and technology developers can easily use in order to improve safety and help drone users fly in accordance with the rules. It is worth mentioning that delivering this package of measures is really not without challenge. So, for example, detection and identification equipment is still part of a developing market, and there is no one silver bullet. In addition, there are not insignificant legal and security considerations associated with deploying this technology. And developing response plans that synchronize the procedures taken by multiple organizations is challenging. For example, at an airport, this would include the airport plan, the airline, and emergency service workers. Lastly, I previously mentioned legislation, so I'm going to briefly return to this before I close. So all of the mitigations I've discussed are underpinned by the Air Traffic Management and Unmanned Aircraft Act, which gained royal assent in April this year. This legislation grants police powers to ensure the skies remain safe and secure from disruption and illegal use of drones. It includes issuing fixed penalty notices, mandating a person to land an unmanned aircraft, and introducing stop and search powers where offences involving unmanned aircrafts can be committed. So we've come a long way, but there's always more to do. In the future, we'll continue to explore and encourage innovative technologies that can be incorporated into counter-drone approaches. We'll also ensure that we take a coordinated approach to funding science, research, and technology development that accelerates the development of potential solutions, as we've already done in other sectors. We also want to explore how we can collaborate with small companies with novel approaches in the development of new systems. And I will leave that there and look forward to the Q&A in an hour's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matti, and thanks for this comprehensive presentation. I will flag the key element you bring from the need for mitigation, the importance of the regulation, and you also ended with this critical element of legislation. Of course, we will come back on the need for strategy, the need for a comprehensive approach. You refer to industry engagement, etc. I think that's a critical element we always tackle when we engage with member states. So thanks a lot, Matti. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor to Sylvain Le Foyer. In addition to be a good friend for years, Sylvain works for the Aviation Security and Facilitation Bureau in the Air Transport Bureau of ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. And he has been there since 2017. Sylvain leads teams responsible for developing aviation security, cyber security, border security, facilitation policies, standards, and recommended practices, what we call SAP. Sylvain has been visiting us several times, attending open briefing, is well known in the community here. Sylvain is the Secretary of ICAO Aviation Security Committee, IC of the International Explosive Technical Commission. Sylvain, you're doing zillion things, and it's a great pleasure and honor to have you on board today to speak about this topic. So are you with us, Sylvain?
Yes, merci Jean-Philippe, I'm with you.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much for this kind of introduction. I will stop my video and share my screen, if you allow me.
I see your picture for the time being. And
okay, so now you should see my screen.
Good, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So quick word on, so you've already introduced me, so I will skip this slide. Quick word on the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a United Nations specialized agency created in 1947, counting also 193 member states like the UN, some slight differences, but that's not the point. And ICAO is issuing legal instruments, conventions, protocols, resolutions, standards. That's the interesting part for today. And these standards that are mandatory for states to apply are addressed to states and contained in annexes to the Chicago Convention. These 19 annexes are, for the most part of them, covering safety, technical standards, but also security and facilitation technical standards. So when we talk about UAS and RPAS, first I would like to thank UNOCT for organizing this webinar, this meeting, and to give ICAO the opportunity to present our work from both the safety and the security perspectives. To start, in civil aviation, we use the term unmanned aircraft, or UA, as an umbrella term for aircraft intended to be operated with no pilot on board. Most of these aircraft operate as part of a system, which we call a UAS, Unmanned Aircraft System. Further subset are remotely piloted, which leads us to remotely pilot aircraft. These remotely piloted aircraft operate as part of a system, the RPAS, with remote pilots. These distinctions have regulatory implications. ICAO has been working for many years now to create a regulatory framework system that will allow fully certificated and mostly large RPAS to conduct flight operations in a manner similar to and consistent with conventional aviation. The remote pilots will interact with air traffic control and other pilots in a transparent manner as the aircraft they are piloting remotely fly through controlled airspace. UAS, while not expected to be integrated into the conventional aviation environment, as are the airpass, are nonetheless expected to behave safely, including by being registered and broadcasting their identification, and by not causing any disruption to the aviation system, persons, and property on the ground. Thousands of operations involving UAS are operating across the globe. UAS, which offer a vast range of capabilities and sophistication, constitute a growing industry with considerable operational opportunities and economic potential. However, since their associated technologies, designs, and operating concepts are evolving rapidly, states are being challenged with their safe and efficient integration into environments shared by a highly regulated and well-established manned aircraft industry. The overwhelming majority of operations bring about economic and societal benefits and take place with the approval and under the oversight of civil aviation authorities. Airpass are limited in numbers at this point, partially due to the status of ICAO standards, most of which are still in development. The fact that these standards will be equivalent to those for commercial air transport aircraft and operations will make this aircraft very reliable and predictable. As a result, the cost of purchasing, operating, and maintaining them will be substantial. Civil remotely piloted aircrafts are anticipated for carriage of heavy cargo over long distances, mapping and surveillance, telecommunications relay, and much more. Occasionally, UAS are used for nefarious purposes, as it has been highlighted already. Likewise, there are instances where disruption caused as a result of ignorance or system failure. Each of these disruptions would need a common response to the immediacy of the event. Airpass operations, while quite conventional in many ways, will introduce new challenges for the aviation system, such as through the risk of interference with or hacking of the command and control link. Addressing these situations will involve many elements of the common response. To this goal, the Aviation Security Panel of Experts is developing in a working group on threat and risk, a global risk context statement dedicated to aviation security. And the threat posed by Airpass and UAS is assessed in this document that is issued every year. ICAO continues to review the possible terrorist-related risk posed by unmanned aircraft as a whole, including small unmanned aircraft and larger and more capable remotely piloted aircraft, across a range of potentially plausible scenarios, but focusing particularly on those where smaller UA or drones could be used by terrorists to conduct an attack, for example, by attaching a payload to them. Such attacks may be directed at aviation targets, which is of interest for ICAO, but it can be more broadly targeted to crowded places or infrastructures. Attacks using smaller UA, which are freely available and are very widely used, are relatively limited in destructive power because of the short range and the small payload of such devices. While larger remotely piloted aircraft are currently much more difficult to acquire, developments in technology mean that there is a growing market for medium-sized remotely piloted aircraft, which could put systems with a range of hundreds of kilometers and a payload of tens of kilograms or more within reach of terrorist organizations. The risk assessment conducted by the Working Group on Threat and Risk addresses the likelihood, the consequence, and the vulnerability. Likelihood is usually assessed as a combination of terrorist intent to commit an act of unlawful interference and their effective capability to do so. Smaller Airpass are easily obtained and now widely used for both commercial and recreational purposes. They are common sight in many parts of the world where their purchase, construction, and use in a number of environments would not attract suspicion. There have been several examples of weaponized Airpass being used against non-aviation targets, mainly in battlefield situations as a form of asymmetric warfare. And the techniques are readily transferable to civilian scenarios. Attack planning on civilian targets has been reported in a number of states, though as yet without successful attacks being launched against aviation targets. Disruption caused by the reckless or malicious use of small aircraft in airspace around airports has also revealed the ease with which incursion can occur, and it has been highlighted by our colleagues from UK. The capability and ease of use of small and medium-sized drones have also increased rapidly over recent years. Use of airspace may also be attractive because it requires little infrastructure, can be carried out remotely, and could potentially circumvent security controls on the ground. While direct targeting of an aircraft in flight would be challenging to carry out successfully, an attack on a just landed aircraft would be plausible, and attacks on fixed aviation assets are not only feasible, but show evidence of having been attempted. In 2019, ICAO increased its assessment of the likelihood of an airpass attack against aviation from low to medium. Consequences. The consequences parameter measures the nature and scale of the consequences of a specific attack in human, economic, political, and reputational terms under a reasonable worst-case scenario. In general terms, the larger the airpass, the greater the potential for structural damage caused by explosion or loss of aircraft and all on board. The Working Group on Threat and Risk has classified the reasonable worst-case consequences of a successful attack on in-flight aircraft with an airpass carrying an IED payload as high. The consequences for other scenarios are assessed as medium, high, or lower. Now, the vulnerability. Vulnerability makes reference to the aviation security capability to detect and deter a successful crafted attack. In other words, it measures the chances an attack would have to go undetected through security controls. The inherent difficulty in preventing the acquisition and malicious use of airpass devices, the increased range of and payload of airpass, and the limited ability to track and prevent use near airports results in an overall higher risk vulnerability. ICAO has assessed vulnerability to attacks on aviation facilities as medium-high, while for certain other scenarios, it is currently assessed as a high. The residual risk, in light of the development of this threat, and in particular that the likelihood of this type of attack is increasing faster than mitigations are being developed, the ICAO has increased its assessment of the residual risk of an attack on aviation targets to medium. So the level is 3 out of 5. In light of this assessment, authorities will need to consider whether additional measures are needed to mitigate this risk and which this may be. The primary mitigation measures for US-themed attacks against aviation are surveillance around airports that may be potential launch site and the development of response plans to mitigate risk by controlled evacuation, combined with resilience plans to enable services to be restored in the event of disruption. Other measures include regulatory systems such as licensing and registration and technical solutions to disrupt unmanned aircraft in flight. Limitation of such measures include the increasing ability to launch UA at long distances, thus bypassing regulatory regimes, and the potential disruptive side effects of the use of interception and disruption techniques in the civilian airport environment. These mitigations are at an early stage of development. It is likely that the number of complementary security layers will be required to mitigate the threat effectively, but no established best practice currently exists. Following the Gatwick incident in 2018, there was a rapidly growing need for action to both protect aviation infrastructure, such as airports, and counter UA through technological means. So ICAO started developing guidance in coordination with the Aviation Security Panel of Experts, guidance that focus on the protection of civil aviation infrastructures against unmanned aircraft, and also provides best practices on prevention, coordination, preparedness, and response. The guidance stresses the need for a multidisciplinary approach that involves all relevant actors and coordination of responsibility between state, local, and airport authorities to allow for appropriate agencies to intervene against UA that are determined to be a threat to civil aviation. So I will not go into the details of the guide. It is available to states because I understand that I've been already very, very long. Sorry for that, Jean-Philippe. Just to to conclude, just a sketch to show the decision process that has been defined and that is available in the guide. It looks very complex when you see it like that, but actually that's very simple. Very few decision to take and quick action to be made after this decision. So it's if you have a reported drone in an area of concern, then you assess if the information is credible or not. If it's credible, you assess whether the location presents an immediate threat to safety. And then if the answer is yes, you need to consider suspending the use of airspace of the runways and start the mitigation and protection plan. So it can be very, very fast and it can be automated. The idea is to have all the stakeholders working together in order to be in capacity to react rapidly when the case when it is needed. So thank you very much for allowing me to present this quite long presentation on what ICAO is doing in this area. I will be very happy to answer any questions, and if it gets too technical, I have some experts with me in the meeting. Back to you, Jean-Philippe. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sylvain. No, you were not too long. It's always very important and informative for all of us to hear the voice from ICAO, the specialized and legitimate body on this topic. And I think for us in the UN family, it's very important, but also for member states when you want to tackle the principle, the regulation, the definition, the role of actors, as you said, it's very important. You refer to evolving threat, risk assessment, but moreover, how to integrate this new phenomena, this new technology into aviation infrastructure, civil aviation. So I thank you, Sylvain, for this presentation. I'm sure we'll go back to that during Q&A. It's now my pleasure to invite Bruno Oliveira Martinez, who is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Bruno is a coordinator of the Security Research Group and a member of the Law and Ethics Research Group. He also had the PRIO Middle East Center, the PRIO Migration Center. So Bruno, Dr. Martins, you have the floor, please.
Thanks so much. It's really my biggest pleasure to address this international expert group meeting and raise some of the key issues surrounding the threat posed by non-cooperative drones. In brief terms, I will talk about the nature of the threat, the technological means to respond to it, but also the societal, human rights, and regulatory problems that still persist today. So the thoughts that I will bring to the discussion emerge out of the work that we conduct at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, through which we have established a fruitful dialogue with policymakers, technology developers, and civil society organizations that work on this specific issue. Some of the people that we have been engaged with in the past are in the audience today. Some of my remarks have some direct operational implications, whereas others point to broader debates that remain unresolved. And so having a continuous conversation on this topic is really fundamental to better identify the contours of the threat, the operational responses to it, and the technological support for that response. And as of today, the combination of the nature of the threat with the operational and technological shortcomings make the vulnerability of soft targets a clear reality. When it comes to the nature of the threat, it's important to note that drones have indeed been used by a range of terrorist groups in different scenarios, but also have been used by other politically motivated actors. And this includes climate activists, for example. Politicians and heads of state have been harassed by drones, the motives for which have never been declared. And whereas the intention to cause harm is certainly different from case to case, from an operational and responsive viewpoint, particularly in some scenarios, for example, in the case of airports, the intention behind the drone operator is less relevant, in as much as the mere non-cooperative character of the intruding drone make it a risk and a threat. So I would say that actually in the field of drones and counter-drone systems in metropolitan areas, the distinction between safety and security has really become blurred. Moreover, counter-drone technologies operating in a regulatory environment that is not fully updated to the technological state of the art are really unable to provide a clear and immediate distinction between mal-intentioned and mere careless drone users. So considering that, for example, in the case of a drone sighting in an urban area, the intention of the drone operator is hard to determine, the vulnerability of the soft target comes from the mere presence of the drone. In some cases observed in the past, for example, when it comes to energy producing facilities, the sighting of a drone has meant everything from industrial espionage to climate activism and terrorism. So the growing perception of the threats posed by drones has, as we've been mentioning before, has led to an emergence of an expanding counter-drone technology market. And today, security practitioners have hundreds of options for systems to both identify non-cooperative drones and to engage or mitigate the threat they pose. Yet, contrary to what most vendors would say, these systems actually face innumerous challenges that result in very substantial difficulties in delivering the security that they propose. Some of the problems that they face are technical. So detection systems face communication interferences, radars mix birds for drones, weather conditions affect mitigating efforts, etc. Other times, the problems have a regulatory nature. For example, in many countries, radio frequency jammers cannot operate in urban environments due to the risk of interference with other channels of communication also operating with the radio frequency, such police, for example. Additionally, the most kinetic mitigating technologies by which non-cooperative drones can be shot by a projectile or attacked by microwaves pose serious risks and in most cases cannot be used in civilian settings where the soft targets are actually placed. And so from this, it results that both the threats and vulnerabilities are real. Yet, like with all cases involving security threats, the real challenge is to strike an acceptable balance between the risk and the response, while ensuring that human rights are respected and broader societal implications are an integral part of the decision-making processes. So our engagement with the regulators, security professionals, and the technological developers has revealed that many of these issues are largely disregarded when decisions are made in this field. And in the remaining minutes of my address, I will focus precisely on these aspects, hoping that with time they can become an integral part of the debates regarding the threat of drones and allow us to go a little bit beyond considerations just about whether or not the counter-drone system works and how much it costs. So the first point that I want to make is that the sighting of counter-drone systems increases threat perception and may generate psychological stress. Some of these systems have a distinct military appearance, and their deployment in civilian context may trigger uneasy feelings. Their deployment needs to be balanced against the actual risk posed by drones, and this needs to be proportional. The civilian airspace is currently facing a phase of re-regulation and reconceptualization in face of the integration of civilian drones. And in this process, we should avoid an over-securitization of airspace in a logic similar to an arms race. As of today, our civilian skies don't need that and should not witness that. The second point I want to make is that counter-drone systems are actually surveillance systems, and they should be treated as such. They collect information about drone users, they generate visual data, they provide geolocation information, and therefore their use needs to comply with the general data protection rules and should not be granted exceptions. The third point that I want to make, and it's also my final one, is a crucial one. Even though most of contemporary drone and counter-drone research and developments happens in civilian and commercial sectors, these fields are still marked today by military logic, testimony to the environment in which drones were first used and for which they were first conceived. The feed of a drone camera over a city resembles the site of a conflict zone. The visual images of people collected by drones portray a vision devoid of humanity. The jargon involving drones and counter-drone systems is often of a military nature. Target, a person of interest, an intruder, mitigation, kinetic, combat proven, etc. All these are expressions that come from the military environment. The growing use of military gear in civilian settings by law enforcement agents and private security companies contributes to a militarization of society that has broad implications that we need to address explicitly, and in my opinion, need to be part of this debate. Additionally, as our societies become smarter and more technologically advanced, dual-use technologies become increasingly important. And given that the technological frontier is often in the civilian and commercial sectors, in areas such as drones to facial recognition technologies and other AI-powered systems, military technologies became dependent on civilian research. And today we witness a proliferation of military-funded research in universities and defense contracts awarded to private companies to conduct research and development. And while much of this is certainly not new, today we can observe a combination of factors that may lead, and in some cases has indeed led, to the militarization of basic research in a movement that does not always abide to the principles of responsible research and innovation. And this risks bringing us backwards to a time where much of civilian research was driven by military imperatives. So all these factors make the drone threat much more than a mere security issues that can easily be solved. I'm afraid it is not, and it cannot. But the efforts to develop responses to it, in that effort, we should be aware of the broader questions at stake here. So I hope that this event provides an opportunity to advance the contours of the discussion and may lead to further international cooperation. This is very important. And finally, it is also crucial that civil society organizations are regularly involved in these debates, because as a broad societal issue, dealing with the risk of drones should involve the participants of all society and not only the end users of either drones or counter-drone technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno, for your contribution. I think you flag a lot of very valid, interesting points about the development and the presence of this new technology in our day-to-day life. You bring a lot of very valid, positive question about where we should draw the line. Of course, we are here speaking about counter-terrorism, but we know it's not always clearly defined everywhere. I really enjoy some of your presentation about this need for rule of law context, rule of law approach, and this is not always clear. You also bring an interesting elements regarding the weakness of such system in certain environment and the risk it presents. And I also like the example you bring on the energy center. At least I'm French, so I remember we had an episode in France where we were very scared by some of the drones over nuclear plants a couple of years ago. So this is reality. All you bring here. I'm sure also Fionella will bring a couple of elements on that, because these are very important elements about our liberty, freedoms, and day-to-day life. Thanks a lot, Bruno, for that. We are running a little bit short of time if we want to have a series of Q&A, and I'm sure we will have. So it's my pleasure now to invite Gunther Povodan. I know Gunther because we work together on the project with Ignacio, but Gunther is a senior consultant for this program. He holds a master's degree in chemical engineering. His background is military and the head of section at chemistry at the CBRN Defense Center of the Austrian Armed Force. He also worked for the European Union's CBRN Risk Mitigation Center of Excellence initiative as on-site expert. He has done a lot of things, and this is why he's our consultant here. And it's my pleasure to ask Gunther to take the floor here for his presentation. Gunther, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. I see my internet connection is a little bit unstable, but I hope it still will work. I just need to start my presentation from this side. Let me check if this works. So,
yeah, you just need to click on the presentation mode here.
Yeah, just let me look if that works. Can you see my presentation?
Wunderbar.
So Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, I will talk about CBRN attacks on vulnerable targets. And this is a low probability, but a high risk issue because they don't happen often, but if they happen, they have a huge impact. So I'll talk about the general objectives and in the impact of CBRN attacks against vulnerable targets with CBRN payloads specifically, and talk about some capability and technology levels, what may be expected from terrorists today, what kind of level they may have, and how to enhance unmanned aircraft systems with CBRN payloads, some technical issues. And finally, we will talk about combating unmanned aerial systems like this, because it's a bit of a difficulty, because bringing down an unmanned aerial or unmanned aircraft with a chemical payload or biological payload may lead to a release of these agents. And so this needs to be taken into consideration as well. So the objectives, generally speaking, of a CBRN attack is that it's a very high threat, which means the proportionality of what we can do against such an attack is accordingly high, because the intention is to kill or injure people or to create a mass panic, because also less toxic substances can be used. Imagine like such a drone flying above a soccer or football stadium, obviously spraying a substance which may create such a mass panic that more people will be injured or die because of this panic than instead of the not toxic agent in this case. In addition, a variety of CBRN materials are suitable for this, such as I said before, less lethal agents such as irritants, but also highly toxic substances like industrial materials like chlorine, hydrogen fluoride, and other substances which may have a huge impact. And of course, top of the line are the chemical or biological warfare agents, but also radiologicals can be disseminated. And here just some photos from an Iranian publication of mustard gas victims on the left-hand side. You see also victims in Iraq from nerve agent intoxication on the bottom. This is from Amnesty International, a photo they published because there was an alleged use of chemical agents in Sudan some years ago. Just to see you that vulnerable targets are really vulnerable. It's not the military. The military can protect themselves. They have their protective equipment, they gear, but the problem is the critical infrastructure and of course the human beings and of course the environment. So now we'll distinguish the objectives of a CBRN attack against critical infrastructure, because this is a different approach, because for a different critical infrastructure, you need more material, more CBRN material to be really have a permanent damage, because the idea is to have a long-lasting contamination of critical infrastructure and a long-lasting damage, finally. So typical agents for such a purpose are radiological devices, highly persistent agents, up to nerve agents like VX or even Novichokes. What can also be done is that water resources can be targeted, and then also less lethal substance can be used. Of course, there will be a dilution effect, but we heard already today, there's also a psychological impact. and people knowing that their water resource has been contaminated, which will have a huge psychological impact, and nobody will drink this water anymore, even if just gasoline has been sprayed above a water resource or something less toxic. And another aspect is a combination with explosives and CBRN agents. We know that unmanned aircraft systems have been already deployed with explosives. And if you combine this with CBRN agents, you have all these debris problem, collapsed buildings, and in addition, you have a contamination. So all the first responders who are on site are in a highly dangerous area. It is very difficult to solve this problem, to rebuild the structure if there's still contamination on the ground. And this requires specific specific capabilities regarding urban search and rescue under CBRN conditions to make a cleanup, to build it up, and to secure the scene and to return the scene to normal, because that's the major objective, to return the scene to normal. So the terrorists' current capabilities are well known that they have already used unmanned aircraft systems with explosive devices, not only as explosive devices, but also for reconnaissance and for surveillance. So the terrorists in advance, before they start the attack, they also will do surveillance and to look around who is there. Where is my target? Is there something that can be an obstacle to my attack? And this means that also these surveillance drones need to be detected early, that they to prevent further action of terrorists. And in addition, this current capabilities, having drones with explosives, can of course be enhanced by chemical, biological, or radiological materials. And I give you some examples how this can be done. What is the current situation is that these terrorists, they know how to use drones. They also can manipulate drone software, because some of the drone software prevents a drone being started near an airport. But if you, for example, have a commercially available drone, you won't be able to launch this drone near an airport, because this is something that is programmed. But terrorists are able to crack and hack such a software so they can operate the drone wherever they want. And the impact can be, like, say, against less vulnerable targets like tanks, but also, of course, the population, soft targets, vulnerable targets in general. So we have different levels of technology for CBRN attacks. If it's a low-level technology, terrorists will just use what they can get, and what they can easily get are commercially available substances like chlorine. Also, it's fairly easy to steal low-level radioactive sources, and also hoaxes can be used, which means it seems to be a chemical agent, but in fact it's just an irritant, because also irritants are widely available. Also, they can use, like everybody can buy, small-scale micro UAVs and simple equipment to delivery. The medium technology would include also already homemade chemical warfare agents, because some of them are quite easy to produce, like sulfur mustard. We know that from the Islamic State is able to produce sulfur mustard on its own. And also toxins are somehow easy to produce. They can also be, you can expect from a medium level technology to have already sophisticated IEDs, crude biologicals, and some military assets like ammunition, which has been found, or something like this. And regarding drones and unmanned aircrafts, they will be small to medium size, which leads us to the high level technology, where you can expect actually everything. So with a high level technology, you can think about biological weapons, the whole range of chemical weapons, drones, drone swarms of all sizes, which means that this kind of technology would need a good sponsor, like state-sponsored or very rich organizations in the background, which can finance such high technology level. And just here are some photos. I don't want to go into the details, but you can mount on these aircraft bombs, bomblets, dispenders, missiles, rockets, bulk containers, cylinders, and so on and so forth, spraying devices. And this also you can do it in a very sophisticated way or in a very simple way. This is a simulation we did in Austria, where we mounted some spraying devices on commercially available drones. And you see what can be done from our side, of course, can be done from terrorist side, because this was part of a project where we tried to bring down these drones. And finally, I will show you some photos about what happens when this drone is on the ground, because still the CBRN hazard is present on the ground. Then for more impact, you need spray tanks, which can hold up, in some cases, holding up to hundreds of liters in a military environment. But if you are thinking about terrorists' capabilities, you will see that they still have the capacity to have about 10 to 20 liters. You also find patents in the internet. So people can look into technology, what is available, and they just rebuild these patents. In this case, I have found let's say, actually planned for a helicopter, but of course you can equip any kind of bigger drone with such a technology. In this case, it's a mixing of liquids intended for riot control, because with this, you mix a dye, a color with a liquid, and then you mark the leader of the gang, the leader of the pack or of the demonstration, and that can of course be misused in the way that you mix binary agents together and get a chemical agent in the end. So this is available, and that's why the knowledge is out there. This has to be known. It needs to be just have people who have some technological scientific background to implement it. And this brings me to the misuse of agricultural drones, because these are available already. In Europe, there are some restrictions because they are only allowed if you have a special permit. Existing, for example, in Germany, where you have steep hills and that you have not access so easily with tractors and trailers. So they are allowed to bring out these pesticides with drones, but still you can buy them. They are commercially available. And the range is about 10 to 25 kilos. And this means that is a lot if you have a small area to cover. So it's enough to, for example, contaminate critical infrastructure. It's enough to create huge panic in a crowded place of people, and has, of course, huge impact if this is a toxic substance. Another aspect are drone swarms, because even easier it is to get access to smaller drones, not these 25 kilo drones, but smaller ones. And even if it's a half a liter or a liter, which you carry with your drone, if you have 20 of them, 50 of them, this is really, you may consider this as a weapon of mass destruction. Even if it's a small size drone with the swarm technology, which you can also program that they work together, that they cover a certain area, this should be, in my opinion, also be thought about subject to the international arms control, including the software to control such swarms, because that is a very critical aspect, even on also the same when they carry explosive charge, not only for chemicals or biologicals. Combating drones is, as we heard today already, it's a difficult issue. It's, well, companies promote that they have done a lot in this case, but it's very difficult. And we simulated such a drone taking over of a control, the control of a drone in an open training field with irritant as a simulant. You bring the drone down, but the question is, where do you bring it down? So if you have a protective plan, an emergency response plan in place, you should also consider, where will I bring the drone down if it's carrying an explosive device, which means also you should detect fairly quickly, is this the drone itself, just a drone, or does it carry something like an explosive payload or a potential CBRN payload? Because that means that you should have in mind where to bring this drone down, and should have a prepared space to bring it down in a safe way. And finally, you need to also dispose it, because if the IED, the improvised explosive device, is still working, you need the EOD operator, the explosive ordnance disposal operator, to finally neutralize it. Regarding prevention response, just an outlook. What we need for that has been also mentioned already in former speeches. The international cooperation for developing proliferation control, because we have some gaps in this, but also we need the compliance of the industry. So the producers of such drones, like especially agricultural drones, should follow the approach of know your customer, which means they should have a direct contact, they should have a background check maybe. This is something we expect from the industry to be cooperative. The next step is detection technologies have to be improved. It's not yet at the stage would be required. We should include explosive ordnance disposal procedures that they know also how to dispose IEDs like this, improvised explosive device like this. Appropriate techniques, tactics, and procedures also to take control over such drones. Finally, it can happen that we need military support to defend unmanned aircraft systems, especially the larger ones, but that would require also think about national legislation, international law, human rights law, that it's proportional. It's important that it's proportionate to the threat. And finally, we have also a bright side of unmanned aerial vehicles, also unmanned ground vehicles, because with that, unmanned aerial vehicles, which is the topic later on, especially tomorrow, that we can really support the units on the ground. We can protect critical infrastructure with surveillance and monitoring and detection. That's just the positive outlook after this more or less a bit, well, let's say, pessimistic view, which I have presented. But still think about it. It's a low probability, but high impact incident. So, and with this, I want to stop my presentation and happy for answering questions in the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Gunther. I will not comment your presentation because it was very comprehensive, and we all thank you for that. We have 5 minutes for Q&A. We all need to stop 10:30 in full respect of the next panel. Otherwise, Fionella will blame me. Again, thanks a lot, Gunther. Very comprehensive. Does anybody want to take the floor for a question? I think we can take 1 or 2 questions if possible, or you prefer to keep your question for later on. So please use the chat group if it is the case. So far, I don't see.
Jean-Philippe, Armenia, the DPR would like to take the floor, please.
Oh, thanks, Ignacio, for assisting me. Armenia, please, Excellence, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, thank you very much. Our thanks to the organizers and the distinguished speakers. Because of the time constraint, I will quickly proceed to my question, with your permission. We thank you for highlighting many aspects of the protection of vulnerable targets and unmanned aircraft systems. In this regard, I would like to add one more element to our discussion, though some speakers highlighted it in the context of strengthening proliferation measures. We believe that one of the measures to address this threat is the protection of, could be the updating of the lists of dual-use goods and technologies within the framework of global and regional export control regimes, and also through introducing legislative changes at the national level to make sure that they remain relevant and applicable in this rapidly evolving technology and security landscape, with the view to prevent export of components used in the production of unmanned aerial systems to those countries who mobilize traced fighters in conflicts and use such systems to target vulnerable soft targets. So I would appreciate the views and assessment of the speakers in this regard. I thank you.
I thank Armenia for this question and contribution. Makes sense. Technology runs fast. The framework must adjust. Do we have any colleagues who wants to briefly react? I don't know, Sylvain, if you have something on this matter, or anybody else from the panel.
Maybe I can quickly start, Jean-Philippe, and then hand over to other experts. We are trying in ICAO to provide a regulatory framework that states have to decline at their level in order to control and manage the way legitimate use of UAS are in each country. When it comes to proliferation and control of technologies and software, that would be more from our colleagues on other organizations that would take the lead. But for the legitimate use of these systems, we provide a global framework. We try to refine it, and we hope that states will apply it consistently. Back to you, Jean-Philippe.
Thanks a lot, Sylvain, for this reply elements information. Do we have any other question, Ignacio? Because I don't always see requests for the floor.
Jean-Philippe, from India, they're asking, what are the enforcement challenges?
Okay. Do we have somebody from the panel who wants to reply? Yes, I guess Bruno.
I could say something, yes.
Yeah.
So, and also regarding the previous question, I think it makes total sense, actually, as it was mentioned in the last presentation. I think that the way that some dual use technologies are evolving, they certainly make them certainly merit an inclusion on the list of dual use technologies that should be subjected to further limitations in terms of proliferation. I fully agree with that. Regarding enforcement, so I think that there are other people are certainly more qualified than me to answer this. There are regulatory challenges. And an important part of the regulatory problems is that they still change from country to country, and even neighbor countries may have different legislations or regulations when it comes to specific technical regulations that will have an impact on whether or not specific counter-drone systems can be used. So we've talked, for example, on the issues of radio frequency jammers that, for example, in some Scandinavian countries can be used in urban settings. In other Scandinavian countries, they cannot. So kind of the pace at which the regulatory work it changes from country to country, and this is important to note. So there is the regulatory aspect, and also, as I alluded to in my presentation, the issue of the actual technical and technological limitations that have a real world operational impact when it comes to enforcement. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. And I think within some of the presentation, we saw the risk to declare some system for agricultural purpose and be diverted from that. Also, on the last point, I think the use of drone in a crime scene, the use of drone during public demonstration, the use of drone during a terrorist attack where you have hostage taking are total different contexts. So the existence of clear SOP for law enforcement agencies is essential, and to act within a rule of law context is also essential. So I just wanted to flag that because we're talking about terrorism, but there are a lot of other elements. So again, bringing back this within the context of terrorist attack, hostage taking, it's a total different context. Ignacio, 10:31, I'm late from 1 minute. I'm very sorry for that. I like to be sharp, but I'm closing this panel and would like to thank all the colleagues. I think it has been a very interesting discussion, and it's only the beginning. We will continue this exchange within this event, but also later on during activities. So over to you, and happy to continue this discussion later on. Thank you, Ignacio, and I see Fernando, so you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe, and congratulations for this extremely interesting session on threats against vulnerable targets, including soft targets and critical infrastructure. And I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. My name is Fernando Puerto Mendoza, and I am a Program Management Officer at the UN OCT Global Counter-Terrorism Program on Unmanned Aircraft Systems. Today, I have the pleasure to be the moderator of the panel on case studies and good practices. To start the session, we have the honor to count with the participation of our keynote speaker, Professor Fionnuala Ní Ealainn, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Professor Ní Ealainn, who took up her functions as Special Rapporteur in 2017, is a University Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, holder of the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy and Society, and Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. She is concurrently a Professor of Law at the Queen's University of Belfast School of Law. Professor Ní Ealainn is the author of numerous books and papers and the recipient of prestigious academic awards and honors. She has served in various international roles, including as a representative of the prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at domestic war crime trials in Bosnia in 1996 and 1997. She has held several appointments, including from the Secretary General of the United Nations as a special expert on promoting gender equality in times of conflict and peacemaking, as well as through the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and UN Women, and the International Criminal Court's Trust Fund for Victims, and nationally in Ireland, where she served in the Irish Human Rights Commission for 5 years. Madam Special Rapporteur, it's a pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by acknowledging the support of the Kingdom of Qatar to this event and really affirm the deep cooperation between my mandate and the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism. I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the leadership of Under-Secretary General Voronkov and his far-reaching and innovative thinking around counter-terrorism challenges around the world. And I'm really grateful for this invitation to participate in what is, I think, a very important meeting. And so we all know, I think, that the use of drones worldwide, whether within the context of domestic law enforcement and counterterrorism, or used extraterritorially in armed conflict or otherwise, remains a matter of substantial legal controversy. And it's a matter of great importance to the mandate that I hold. Drone technology, as we all know, is proliferating at a tremendous speed. Last year, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, my colleague on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, reported that at least 102 countries have acquired an active drone inventory, and around 40 or so possess or are in the process of procuring armed drones. So I want to make three fundamental points today, really focusing in on the international law and human rights landscape of deployment of this technology. And the first really simple one is that the use of drones domestically in law enforcement contexts, including in the context of protecting critical infrastructure, must fully comply with states' obligations under international human rights law. This includes ensuring respect and enforcement of the obligations that states have willingly signed up to protect the right to life, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of expression and freedom of association. So that's the first. The second is that the obligation to safeguard human rights entails highly practical implications. It's not an abstract obligation, it's a very practical obligation in the nitty-gritty of purchasing, planning, and executing drone operations, including those that have the goal of protecting civilian infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure and vulnerable targets are not separate from those obligations. They're absolutely bound by those obligations. And that includes investigating any alleged violations after the fact of use. The third general point I would make is that states have to be very, very mindful that serious human rights concerns attached to the onward transfer of drone technology to other states. And I think that has to be really clearly stated, that where there are really deep concerns about human rights practice or evidence that states have engaged in serious human rights violations, specifically in the context of counterterrorism, really hard questions arise about the transfer of such technologies. Here, I also want to stress the need for requisite and adequate legal protections for data collection, use, storage, and transfer, thus the protection of privacy in the context of a microphone on. I'll keep going, and perhaps the moderator can mute the microphone. So let me talk about a little bit more about that nitty-gritty of human rights law. And so I'm making clear from the onset that the use of drones in law enforcement contexts will always, without exception, be subject to the state's international human rights obligation. And that applies even in contexts where states will assert that their counterterrorism or law enforcement efforts happening in their own territory are occurring within the context of an armed conflict. The fundamental protections of international human rights law are not displaced by either armed conflict or by the statement of a national security threat. Now, it's clear that there are other additional rules that apply, and governments have to pay attention to those rules, including international humanitarian law obligations. But states are also absolutely bound by their human rights obligations. And so let me quote one decision from the International Court of Justice, the advisory opinion on the legality of the use of nuclear weapons, a really highly relevant parallel universe to our discussion today. And the court said, and I'll quote, human rights law does not cease in times of war except by operation of Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, whereby certain provisions can be derogated from in a time of national emergency. Respect for the right to life, however, is not such a provision, end quote. So it's really clear we're talking about the use of unmanned aircraft systems by law enforcement in the context of vulnerable targets and infrastructure. And one point I want to stress for you all is that we have to be really focused on what we mean and what is defined as a vulnerable target or a critical infrastructure. Because many of those critical infrastructures, I'm thinking of hospitals, schools, government buildings, airports, these are absolutely essential to the delivery and practice of human rights, particularly the fundamental rights to thrive and survive for persons in any society. And so ensuring that those infrastructures remain open to, accessible to, and again, to harken back to a point that was made earlier, to avoid the deep securitization and militarization of those spaces is really important, because those spaces are critical to the work that most people do in the societies they live in. It's important to say when states are exercising jurisdiction in their domestic context, that because this work is being done domestically, is being done in national legal systems on national territories, then the full range of human rights obligations apply. So let me just talk a bit more deeply about what those human rights obligations are. One I've alluded to already, which is the right to life. And I want to again be clear that to the extent that an armed drone technology is used, or that a drone is being used to support broader law enforcement strategies that are underpinned by the use of force, then the human rights obligations of states to protect life apply in that context. The second is the right to privacy, insofar as, and we know that this has been the practice of states, those drone technologies are used for gathering information and surveillance. The third is the area of freedoms of expression and association that are directly and indirectly affected by the kind of widespread and remote surveillance that drone technologies enable. And the fourth is the right to access and meaningfully exercise fundamental economic and social rights, including but not limited to the right to health and education. So let me say a little bit about what each one of those four rights areas mean, and then I'm going to say one or two words about transfer of technology and hopefully stay within time. So I've already said that the right to life is implicated either when drones are armed or where unarmed drones are used to support the use of force on the ground by law enforcement agencies. And in this context, I want to stress, and I think you all know this, we know this practically, that surveillance drones are readily and cheaply armed. And drone manufacturers are reportedly, we all know, actively engaged in marketing models of drones which are armed with tasers, tear gas, and pepper spray to law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. I'll give one example because it happens to be close to where I'm calling in today from the United States, which is that North Dakota has become the first jurisdiction in the United States to authorize taser-enabled armed drones for policing purposes. And so the direction of travel of the use of drones for armed purposes in domestic context, I think is very clear to us all. But even where the drones themselves are not armed, where surveillance drones are used to support the use of force on the ground by law enforcement, those drones are also then subject to the right to life protections. So what does that right to life protection practically mean for law enforcement agencies? Well, it means really specific obligations, and I'm going to name a few of them. The first is that in order to ensure that rights are not violated in deployment, it means that states in advance of deployment have to ensure that certain obligations are put in place. The first is planning. When planning is done to purchase, to use, or to deploy these unarmed devices or aerial devices, you have to consider whether the particular deployment is necessary and proportionate to the intended objective. And that's an ongoing test for law enforcement agencies. And I'm stating the obvious, which I know many of you know, that is a burdensome and significant requirement. The second is that states have obligations to conduct investigations if there are any breaches of the right to life by their agents or the use of these technologies in the process of taking life. Planning is meticulous. It requires this advance work to be done. And it requires states to ensure that if there are other alternatives, that they be used and that other alternatives be exhausted before deploying a technology which may implicate protection for the right to life. That kind of planning has to be done rigorously by intelligence, law enforcement, and military agents before any decision is made to deploy targeting capacity in a domestic context. Secondly, let me talk about investigation. We have an enormous body of international law from the UN Human Rights Committee, from regional human rights bodies in Latin America, in Africa, in the European context, that requires states to investigate any issues of violations that emerge with the use of these technologies. They include prompt investigations, they include effective and thorough investigations, they include impartial and independent investigations, and they include the ensuring that victims have a full and engaged right to be participating in processes of investigation. Those are all heavy and important burdens, but they're important, and it's important that when we talk about the use of technologies, that these considerations are implemented from the beginning. They're not separate from, they're not a side requirement, they're an integral requirement to the use of these technologies in the context we're talking about. Let me close by making a couple of final remarks about the dispersal of technology. And I want to say that we are all aware of the proliferation of this technology. And the mandate I hold is really conscious that states carry out joint law enforcement operations, and that agencies, all of you, often are required to and engage in sharing information and expertise with your counterparts for legitimate law enforcement objectives. But it has been a significant concern of my mandate by the process that states are collaborating and providing technical assistance and capacity building worldwide, including through the transfer of military and dual use technology, including drones and ultimately armed drones. Experience that we have seen suggests that even the transfer of technologies that are, for example, initially merely surveillance technologies, inexorably leads to a chain of the use of armed drones or armed technologies. And so if we are in that space, then states and of course United Nations entities must ensure that they do not facilitate, whether intentionally or through failures of due diligence, facilitate the unlawful use of drones, armed drones by other states in the counterterrorism context. These are particularly acute concerns because, as many of you know, many of the uses of these technologies are justified on the basis of domestic counterterrorism definitions and objectives. And I have continued to express the concerns about the consistent lack of a clear definition under international law, but a variety of broad and vague definitions at national level of what constitutes terrorism. And my deep concern is that occasionally we do see and concern about the scale of the ways in which terrorism language is used to address other political agendas, which are simply inconsistent with international law. So what this means is that we have to be really careful when we are transferring technologies on the basis of countering terrorism, when the definitions of terrorism at domestic level are inadequate or legally problematic. Once these technologies are in widespread use domestically, the other concern I have is that we will have a further and deeper challenge in preventing the control and spread of these technologies to non-state actors. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Summary and Arbitrary Executions has noted in a report last year that there are at least 20 armed non-state actors reporting the use of armed and unarmed drone systems. So what does this mean? It means that we have to be very careful about the proliferation that we engage in that further supports and engages the proliferation among non-state armed groups. And the danger here is that if we are not closely scrutinizing transfer and we're not closely scrutinizing the justification and necessity of drone operations at the national level, we encourage a landscape which is simply a landscape of proliferation without adequate legal constraint. And the danger is in the long term that undermines the security we are all committed to. So I'm really grateful. I will close there by saying that I'm very grateful that we're keeping these concerns to the fore of the conversation, and particularly grateful to UNOCT for integrating and ensuring that human rights is at the center of the conversations we have about these technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Special Rapporteur, for these thought-provoking remarks. If you allow me to highlight the three key points that you addressed. First, the obligation of law enforcement to use UAS for counterterrorism in a manner that is compliant with international human rights law. Second, that this duty has implications at all stages of drone operations. And third, that the fact that states should take into account the implications that relate to the transfer of drone technology to states that do not possess the requisite respect for human rights. And indeed, mainstreaming human rights while countering terrorism is one of the 4 pillars of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, and of course, a key priority for UNOCT. Madam Special Rapporteur, on behalf of UNOCT, I would like to thank you for your participation in this event. And now, before I introduce the first speaker, I'd like to remind participants that you can present your questions on the chat or ask for the floor using the corresponding function in Zoom, and we will address them hopefully at the end of the session, if time permits. As our first panelist, I'd like to introduce Mr. Lee Pen Yang, who is a Senior Assistant Director on Policy Development at the Joint Operations Group of the Ministry of Home Affairs of Singapore. Mr. Lee Pen Yang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fernando. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak on Singapore's experience in managing drones. So I will just go ahead and share my slides. So the first thing that we have done in addressing the drone security threat is to try to define what the drone security threat is. We have come up with this slide. Firstly, we have identified potential modes of attack, which a former colleague has mentioned in detail, so I won't belabor the point. There are also certain advantages in conducting drones, using drones to mount attacks that we think are different from the kinds of threats that we may face otherwise, for example, from vehicle-borne IEDs and so on. First, there is the ability to deploy a specific drone to a vulnerable location with speed and accuracy, circumvent traditional security measures. Attacks can be conducted from a distance with low risk to the operator. It's possible to gain close proximity to the target deployed while deploying a small payload. And also, as mentioned by my colleague earlier, conduct a swarm attack that restrain your ground forces. Some examples of previous incidents that we have taken note of and which we are following closely: potential damage that drones may cause to aircraft, disruption of flights and airport operations. Here in Singapore, there have been no direct occurrences of weaponized drone attacks, but even so, they present other risks. For example, safety risks when intruding into high-profile events with high footfall. And also in June 2019, we had drone sightings around Changi Airport that caused runway operations to be disrupted, causing flight delays and diversions. So we recognize that there is an important need to balance safety and security risk with the legitimate use of drones, for example, commercial purposes and recreational photography. Singapore's approach is spread across three pillars. First, we have legislation, then enforcement, and finally, we also have education. We have a regulatory framework in place. In 2015, we passed the Unmanned Aircraft Public Safety and Security Bill to regulate drone operations. And this was strengthened in 2019 with the passage of the Air Navigation Amendment Bill to enhance drone controls. So the first kind of controls we require is that certain drone flights require permits. So those that are neither recreational nor for research purposes all require permits. Drones which are larger than 7 kilos require permits. And those within specific areas also require permits. For example, within 5 km of a civilian aerodrome, within a protected, restricted, or danger area. And also those that are operating above 200 feet above mean sea level. Certain dangerous drone activities are prohibited, like carriage of dangerous materials and discharge from drones. And finally, registration is required for any drone that weighs above 250 grams. We have undertaken enforcement efforts to deter non-compliance, investigate offences, and we have been prosecuting such offences. So one example I listed here is 2 individuals who were found flying a drone near an airport without a permit, and both of them were sentenced to fines. We have strengthened our penalties to ensure that they are commensurate with the impact. Firstly, to send a strong deterrent signal to would-be operators, and also to ensure that the future would-be offenders will not be persuaded to continue. So for our first-time offenders, we are looking at fines up to $50,000 and or imprisonment up to 2 years. Beyond this, we have moved to have strong public education to promote responsible use of drones, including publicizing responsible drone flight operations, training, and also publication of prosecution of various cases. We have also put up signs at various areas where drone flights are prohibited. We recognize that measures to manage drones will continue to evolve, and we're also closely monitoring drone developments and taking further steps to enhance our regulatory regime if needed. We look forward to greater collaboration among like-minded countries to share best practices and also experience in managing drones. And finally, we will continue to conduct a periodic review of drone standards, regulation, and other controls. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee Peng Yang, for sharing these interesting remarks on case studies in Singapore. I'm sure the audience will have a number of questions later on when we move to the Q&A session. Our next panelist, I would like to introduce is Mr. Guy de Couver, team leader of the Robotics and Autonomous Systems Unit at the Department of Mechanics of the Belgian Royal Military Academy. Mr. de Couver is project coordinator of multiple European projects, amongst others on the subject of crisis management and threat detection. And at this moment, he coordinates the European project Courageous, which aims to develop standardized test methods for drone detection, tracking, and identification of solutions. Mr. De Kover, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And indeed, today I'm going to talk to you about the European project Courageous. So what is this about? Well, we have already seen in all the presentations today that drones can be very serious threats to vulnerable targets. And police forces around the world and other end users, they are searching for solutions to this problem. Now, commercial companies have obviously also jumped into this new market. And the result is that we now have a very large amount of commercially available drone detection systems. You see some presented here on this slide. It's not only drone detection, we're talking about drone detection, tracking, and identification solutions. In fact, we had in the year 2019 already more than 100 commercial available counter-UAS systems on the market present. Which is good on one hand, because we have some solutions for the problem. On the other hand, it also presents a problem because these different systems are each good for different use cases, and it is not clear to the end users what system they should use for their use case scenario. Furthermore, and it has already been raised today as well, as the performance claims made by the manufacturers of these solutions are often quite unsupported by any real evidence. And this is due to the fact that there is at present no uniform test methodology, which makes a fair comparison between the different test results impossible. Now, the Counter-Terrorism unit of DG Home from the European Commission, they noted this capability gap, and they have set up a European program for counter-UAS systems testing. And it is a Courageous project which is, let's say, implementing this program. And the first step we do is identifying a set of relevant standard scenarios. And these relevant standard scenarios, they are based on the current threats and the current threats which are faced by mostly police forces. So our first question was, what are the current threats? And here I can already show you a first flavor of some of our results because the project has just begun. So what we have done is, it's one of the partners within Courageous, it's Interpol, has compiled a database of more than 800 incidents around the world. And they have classified all these incidents in different categories. And as you can see on the graph, most incidents are due to uninhibited users. So that means people that are malevolent users, but that try to fly outside of the legal framework. But there are also an important amount of incidents due to outright criminal and terrorist activities. And when we look at the targets that are being confronted with drone problems or US problems, we note that an important fraction are airports, as already was previously noted by ICAO, but also private installations, government installations, military installations, prisons, and law enforcement and first responders are being targeted. And when we look at the type of incidents that we see already occurring today, we see that the number of real attacks is still relatively low. Of course, this is on the global scale of more than 800 incidents. But we do see important incidents related to trespassing, and that's more on the industrial side then. But also the terrorist threats, espionage, smuggling. It can be smuggling of drug smuggling often. There are crashes, and then there are the near misses with manned aviation. Those are the large categories of types of incidents we have identified. And now, based on this analysis, we are going to develop functional and performance requirements for the counter-UAS systems and set up a number of standard scenarios, and more importantly, also the metrics which are related to those, derive the metrics that are related to those scenarios. Then this will be employed to develop a standardized testing methodology, and not just yet another test, but one standard test methodology. And we will validate this test methodology by carrying out 3 different performance tests of commercial counter-UAS solutions. There will be 1 test in Belgium, 1 in Greece, and 1 in Spain. And finally, and this is also important towards all of you here present today, is that our clear goal is to share the results of this study as responsibly as possible with all the end user community, because the goal of this study is in fact to come to a better understanding of the performance and the capabilities of counter-UAS solutions among all end users. So this is in a nutshell what we are doing within the European project Courageous. We are building towards a better global common understanding of the performance and the capabilities of counter-UAS technologies, and we're specifically focusing on detection, tracking, and identification solutions. And we do this by developing a standardized test methodology for these drone detection, tracking, and identification solutions. The project has just started, but you see that we have already shown you some results, the analysis of the database of drone incidents. And we hope that in the future we can show you more results and share the outcome of our work with you, and that we can come to a globally accepted standard test for counter-UAS solutions, so that we have a better way of protecting our vulnerable targets. I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I am happy to answer those in the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Mr. de Koever. And indeed, countering UAS threats is an extremely complex and fascinating area, given the comprehensive challenges that you mentioned. And it's really good to learn that there are regional initiatives to identify solutions for these problems. Moving on the agenda, I'd like to introduce our new speaker, Mr. Don Rassler, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Combating Terrorism Center, CTC, at the US Military Academy at West Point in USA. Mr. Rassler is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Director of Strategic Initiatives at the CTC. His role as Director of Strategic Initiatives involves managing special projects and important center relationships, and provides advice to the CTC director about the growth and development of the center. His research interests are focused on how terrorist groups innovate and use technology, counterterrorism performance, and the evolution of counterterrorism practices and strategy, and understanding the changing dynamics of militancy in select countries in Asia. Prior to joining the CTC, Mr. Rassler worked on intelligence, defense reform, and NATO transformation projects, with emphasis on the Balkans for the Department of Defense as a senior consultant at Deter. Mr. Rassler, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fernando, and for the kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the UN Office of Counterterrorism and Undersecretary General Voronkov and the rest of the members of the team for the opportunity to speak with you today. It is an honor. All of us here recognize that even though the Islamic State's drone capabilities have been degraded and do not pose the threat that they once did, the group's drone program evolved into a significant problem in what appeared to be a short amount of time during the 2016 to 2018 period. During its heyday, the Islamic State's drone threat was typified by the group's successful ability to drop munitions from commercial quadcopters that had been simply modified to maim, kill, and instill fear. An important reflection of the seriousness of the Islamic State's drone threat can be found in a statement that General Tony Thomas made in May 2017 while he was serving as the head of U.S. Special Operations Command, when he identified the Islamic State's drone capabilities as, quote, the most daunting problem of 2016. That is a serious statement for the head of U.S. Special Operations to make. And even though the Islamic State drone threat has been curtailed, what has become clear with the passage of time is that the Islamic State, due to its innovations, was a leading edge indicator of what hybrid conflicts are likely to look like in the future and where the non-state actor drone threat is likely headed. So with the time that I have, I would like to walk through some key aspects of the Islamic State's drone program and outline 5 focus areas where armed non-state actors and terror groups have placed historical operational drone emphasis, as those areas are likely to remain key terror drone threat vectors in the years ahead. I will then conclude with some thoughts about what we might see next. Terrorist group interest in our use of remotely piloted aircraft, unmanned aerial systems, or drones, whichever term you prefer, as we all recognize, is not new, nor is it limited to organizations inspired by jihadist ideology. The first verified terrorism drone case occurred in 1993 when members of Shinrikyo, a Japanese terrorist group inspired by apocalyptic ideology, experimented with and considered using a remote control helicopter to distribute sarin gas to kill a rival leader in Japan. Then, more than a decade later in 2004, the Shia militant group Hezbollah flew a drone from southern Lebanon into Israel, and in doing so, became the first known terrorist or proxy actor to fly a drone across an international border. There's also evidence that terrorist groups or individuals suspected of being motivated by terrorist intent possessed and or used a drone in at least 12 different countries prior to the formal establishment of the Islamic State's caliphate in June 2014. So even though the Islamic State innovated and was able to use commercially available and homemade do-it-yourself style drones in new and unique ways, the terror drone issue was already a well-proliferated problem, with interest being shown by geographically distributed entities before June 2014. Thus, the Islamic State's drone activity is best understood not as some type of entirely new development, but rather as a new iteration of a specific terrorist interest area with more than 2 decades of history. To reduce the risk of strategic surprise and mitigate future non-state actor terror drone threats, it is important to identify historical focus areas where terror groups have placed operational emphasis and or demonstrated interest. In my review of the terror drone phenomenon, 5 such areas stand out. The first noteworthy area of terror drone interest is a desire to use drones to deliver chemical and biological weapons. This interest was first observed by the actions of Shinrikyo in 1993 and was noticed again 2 decades later in 2013 after evidence emerged that the Islamic State was also exploring this capability. This focus area takes on enhanced significance given the Islamic State's repeated use of chemical weapons in Syria and a disruption of several chemical and biological terrorist plots linked to the group over the last several years, including a very serious ricin plot thwarted in Germany in June 2016. Continued international emphasis in this area is critical. The second focus area is terrorist group use of drones for cross-border missions, a precedent first set by Hezbollah in 2004, and that the organization has repeated since. Given the defensive measures Israel has put in place, it is now harder for Hezbollah to conduct these type of missions. But Hezbollah's cross-border drone flights into Israel are noteworthy as they demonstrate a capability to fly and control drones at range. The cross-border utility of drones has also been demonstrated more recently by the drone operations and attacks attributed to Houthi rebels that have been launched from Yemen. Due to advancements in technology, in the future, commercial drones will be able to fly farther, for longer, with greater power, more autonomy, and likely at greater speed. Factors which will lead to new threat possibilities, including opportunities for non-state actors to attack targets from greater standoff distances. The third focus area of note is terror group desire to weaponize remote control aircraft and drone platforms, which many of the speakers have touched on as well today. This threat area in recent years has also spread and proliferated. as over the past several years, various non-state militant groups around the world have acquired, deployed, and tried to weaponize drones, like the Islamic State did during the 2016 to 2018 period. The fourth focus area of note is the existence of resourced non-state actor drone programs run by at least two terror-linked groups, Hezbollah and Hamas, prior to the Islamic State's caliphate announcement in June 2014. The subsequent development of the Islamic State's drone program makes it all the more important that we recognize that the drone actions of some terror groups are not a series of one-off events, but rather a more structured, integrated, and resource capability, features which have a bearing on the sophistication and endurance of the threat. The fifth and last area I'll mention is the ability of several militant groups to either gain access to drone feeds or to hack drones operated by nation states. These types of incidents are a useful reminder that the counter-drone competition between states and non-state actors is an iterative cat and mouse game that will continue to evolve with advancements and innovations being made by all parties. So if all these things had already occurred before the Islamic State and its drone bomb drop capability exploded onto the scene in 2016, what, if anything, makes what the Islamic State achieved with drones significant or unique? Two factors stand out in this regard. First, the Islamic State is the first known terror group that used a drone, especially a commercially available device, to kill. The second factor that is new and makes the Islamic State's drone program stand out is that the group was able to source, assemble, deploy, and make successful use of a fleet of creatively modified, commercially available drones, and in some cases homemade drones, and do so at scale. Given the relatively low cost of the drones the Islamic State used, and the ease with which those and other similar forms of dual-use technology can be purchased or repurposed, there is a danger that other hostile non-state actors will look at the Islamic State's drone program as a component or model that could be used to augment or enhance their existing capabilities for asymmetric warfare strategies. And unfortunately, that future is already playing out. So as we prepare for the future and think through how the international community can best prevent or mitigate the effects of future terror drone attacks, attention should be placed on the 5 historical terror drone focus areas I just mentioned. This is because having a deep understanding of where terror groups have demonstrated interest and or used drones can help us to anticipate how the terror drone threat might evolve in the years ahead. But as we can all appreciate, the terror drone threat will also evolve in other new unanticipated ways. For example, one threat vector that has already emerged and that we were likely to see more of soon is the use of not just a single drone, but multiple drones to conduct operations with the potential for a collection or swarm of drones to increasingly operate in a coordinated fashion. Another similar threat vector that deserves consideration is how the capabilities of commercial drones can be enhanced or augmented through the creative combining of hardware and software. This would include the leveraging of tools like facial recognition software to enable targeted assassinations, or software developed to estimate crowd size, repurposed so drones can inflict more harm. Another area that appears to hold a lot of potential for terrorist groups and which would likely be hard to prevent or mitigate are drone operations that place emphasis on speed. This could include, for example, the leveraging of high-speed drone platforms like those used for drone racing to conduct targeted surprise attacks. Lastly, while emphasis has primarily been placed on the threats drones pose from the air, in the future, we're also likely to see terrorist use of land and sea drones too. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rassler, for sharing your research on terrorist use of drones and for highlighting the efforts of terrorist groups to innovate and develop new technologies to perpetrate their attacks. Also for your recommendations on strategies to anticipate to this threat. And I must say, I'm very impressed on the good timekeeping of all the panelists. I think we're doing very well on time. Let me remind all participants that you can share your questions and start posting them on the chat. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Mr. Rafael Godoy Rubio, who is the director of the Telecommunications Engineering School of the University of Malaga in Spain. Mr. Godoy is a telecommunications engineer from the University of Malaga and PhD from the University of Granada. And as a professor, he has taught in the degrees of engineering on electronic systems, telematics, telecommunication systems and telecommunication technologies. As a researcher, he is a member of the Photonics and RF Research Lab in the ICT Engineering Communications Research Group, the University Institute for Telecommunications Research, TELMA, and the Malaga Biomedical Research Institute, IBIMA. Godoy was also Deputy Director of Students and Business Relations between 2013 and 2016, and Director of the Department of Communications Engineering between 2016 and 2020. Mr. Godoy, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Could you confirm that the presentation is?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to participate in this meeting to share the work we are doing in Spain for the southern city of Malaga. Today, I'm going to introduce a successful case of collaboration between the university, industry, and police and military corps. This collaboration started in 2011 between the School of Telecommunication Engineering and a spin-off company created by former students and a professor of our school. So in the following years, several security public entities have joined our open innovation ecosystem, such as the Spanish Ministry of the Interior and the European Network of Law Enforcement Technology Service, which is a group composed of police forces from all member states of the European Union. So we need to point out two very important and innovative aspects of our activity. The first one is that we don't manufacture drones. We use drones in our solutions, but manufacturing them is not our added value. The second one is that we focus our activity on the digital transformation of drones and counter-drones devices. In other words, we put the focus on the concept of drones connected to the network. In order to understand our innovation concept, it's important to do a quick analysis based on answering these three questions. The first one is, how do others do it? The second one is, how do we do it? And the third one is, what does our solution bring to the table? Well, let's start with the first one. How do others do it? Traditionally, the use of drones in security has been based on the paradigm one pilot, one drone. This is the concept of drones 1.0. And this involves costs associated with the purchase of the technology and high hidden costs associated with the operation. The drone is bought only once, but the operation is a repetitive cost. So if we multiply the number of drones in the organization, the operational costs will skyrocket. So we have the challenge of being able to find a technology that drastically reduces operating costs while paying a little more for the technology. The objective is for the drone activity to produce more savings as the organization grows. The second problem to be solved is the slow data flow while using drones in the original paradigm. It can take minutes, hours, or even days from the time the drone picks up the information to the time it reaches its final destination. And this is devastating when rapid decision-making is required, which is common in security. The challenge is to find a technology that can send information in real time to as many people as necessary, regardless of the distance. The last problem with traditional drone activity is that some drone manufacturers send their data to third parties. So these kind of drones are not attractive for security. So how do we solve all these problems? Our technology innovates by housing all system intelligence in a software connected to an IP network. This makes it possible to create global private drone networks which can operate anywhere in the world. You can connect drones from any manufacturer to your own network. So the system is device agnostic. In addition, drones can be piloted from command and control centers located anywhere in the world too. Manual flights are also possible. Then all data is stored on the servers. So all information is accessible from remote terminals. And now it comes a very important capability of this technology. You can also connect counter-drone devices to the network. So you can protect scenarios with drone and counter-drone at the same time and with the same information system. Drones for surveillance tasks and counter-drones for protection against enemy drones. Using a single system is very important as it allows you to perform counter-drone actions selectively on enemy drones without affecting my friendly drones. Finally, the system is scalable, so you can add as many drones and counter-drones devices as you need in different scenarios by simply increasing the capacity of the servers. Well, we have analyzed how others do it with drones 1.0. So the performance is linear. We have analyzed how you can do it with drones 2.0, and the performance is exponential. And thirdly, the benefits of our scalable technology, reduction of operational costs, drone and counter-drone protection under the same system, real-time information, and finally, secure information in communication and storage. It's very important to pay attention to the scalability factor. Today's threats are global and therefore scalable. So finding local solutions such as the 1.0 solutions is not the smartest strategy for states. Global threats need scalable solutions. And this is why the entrance of the laboratories of the University of Malaga, where Aeorum, which is this company, the spin-off company from the University of Malaga, the unique selling proposition is a scalable security against global threats. That is the philosophy of our collaboration. The technologies are now ready for operation. Any of you who are interested in getting it can ask for more information. And here are just a few pictures to get an idea of what the components look like. Servers with the digital platforms software, Surveillon. Here it is, the command and control centers, One more. A mobile command and control center. Different devices from any manufacturer, in this case, drones. The applications for the security sector are widely ranging. Any vulnerable target can make use of drone and counter-drone protection simultaneously. Moreover, as the system is global, simultaneous protection actions can be performed in different scenarios at the same time. In addition to the protection of vulnerable targets, drone applications are also extensible to other sectors, contributing to the fulfillment of sustainable development goals. So here you have our contacts in case you are interested in our technologies or in collaborating with the University of Malaga. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any question in the Q&A section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Godoy. And as it was highlighted throughout the event today, and in multiple United Nations resolutions, countering terrorist threats requires an all-of-society approach. And you have provided a successful example of collaboration between academia and the private sector. Thank you for that. Now, before opening the floor for questions and answers, I would like to use this opportunity to make a brief introduction of UNOCT's Global Counter-Terrorism Program on Unmanned Aircraft Systems that I have the honor to co-implement. So let me quickly share my screen. Okay. So the global program was started just this year in 2021 with the objective of contributing to the development of cooperative approaches to strengthen the security of member states to counter the threat of terrorist use of UAS while making full use of the power of new technology as a tool to prevent and counter terrorism. The program places a strong focus on the human rights implications of the use of UAS by law enforcement for counterterrorism purposes. So as part of this project, we are currently collecting the views of experts and counterterrorism practitioners, like all the participants in this event, to identify the current gaps and specific capacity building needs. For this, we have designed an electronic survey that will support us to develop more targeted products for those member states that request our support. So all participants in this expert group meeting are invited and encouraged to participate in this survey, regardless of your background. It will take less than 5 minutes to complete, and it will present questions regarding the profile of the respondent, the state of play of training capacities in your organization or in your country, and finally, your perceived needs. So this should be filled in at an individual level based on your perception. You can use this QR code that I'm showing in the screen, and I will quickly paste the link on the chat so all participants can have access to the survey. It will also be distributed after the event with all the participants by email. And with this, I would like to open the floor for questions and to see if we have any questions already in the chat. I remind participants that you can raise your hand using the corresponding function on Zoom. So I see there is one question from Sylvain Keller from the UNODC Terrorist Prevention Branch. Okay, you can please mute your microphones and ask for your floor.
Yes, I'm saying the question.
Yes, Mr. Sylvain, if you want to go ahead and ask
Okay,
your question.
so I'm working at the UNODC TPB Sub-Saharan Africa office, and I just wanted to get a point on the situation in Africa regarding drones, the use of drones by terrorist groups, because it's a matter we really need to consider now regarding the fact terrorist groups are using it in Somalia, DRC. And I wanted mainly to get your opinion about how are actually the African governments considering this threat in their counter-terrorist strategy. If you have an idea about that, I would be very grateful if you can give us some information. Thank you very much.
That's an excellent question, I perhaps based on the research profile, I will address the question to Mr. Rasler, but the panel, please feel free to request the floor, and I will hand over. Mr. Rasler, do you have any comments or?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a great question, an important question, and so we've been looking at sort of drone activity globally, and so I think what would be helpful is I can connect you to our African research program lead at the Combating Terrorism Center, my colleague, Dr. Jason Warner, who's been following sort of regional developments in that part of the world more closely. And so he would, be able to provide a more useful answer than I would about sort of dynamics specific to Africa. And so, let's connect offline so we can get you a better answer to your question. I know on the threat side that he's looked at this, and some of the other researchers that we work with have looked at this. But in terms of how African governments are responding to this, my colleague Jason would have a better response. So, I'd like to connect you with him so it can be more helpful.
Thank you so much. Anybody else in the panel who would like to comment?
Just briefly comment, Fernando, take the opportunity to say that I think one of the broader issues this raises is around, whole-scale, all-of-government planning around the range of responses to counterterrorism. I know we've had ongoing discussions within the UN system around the production of national action plans. And from the mandate's perspective, of course, there's a piece of that planning that involves a range of threat assessments, but also the integration of the full scope of stakeholders, including civil society actors in that discussion, and a totality of perspectives on how we understand and assess threat, as well as the human rights obligations that respond to threat. But the central piece of that is really thinking about integrated and holistic planning in the context of counterterrorism and using the strategy process to identify and manage those.
Thank you so much, Professor Nia Alain. Excellent remarks. Do we have any other thoughts to answer the question? Any other questions? I'm just typing the link to the survey that I just mentioned, so all participants have access to it. It will be emailed as well to the participants who registered, and individual responses will be welcome. So rather than having one answer by agency, to have multiple answers, one per participant in the event. So we've done excellently well on time. We are 9 minutes ahead of schedule. And now, if we don't have any other questions or comments, I'd like to thank the panel for your time, for your excellent remarks. And I would like to hand over the floor to my colleague, Olga, who will manage the session to summarize the conclusions for the first day. So, Olga, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Fernanda. Very much, dear participants, dear colleagues. My name is Olga Lanchenko. I am a program management officer at UNOCT, and I'm a part of the team implementing the global program on the protection of vulnerable targets against terrorist attacks. Today, I have the great pleasure to conclude the discussion of day 1 of the International Expert Group meeting on vulnerable targets and unmanned aircraft systems. Our program coordinator, Ignacio Banas, will present in detail our flagship initiative tomorrow when opening day 2 of the expert group meeting. The program is being implemented by UNOCT, CITED, the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, and UNICRI, and in cooperation with Interpol. Please allow me to take this opportunity to thank our partners for the great cooperation and dedication to our common goals. Good practices, case studies, lessons learned, recommendations, and conclusions discussed and shared during these 2 days will inform the new module guides on the protection of vulnerable targets, which we plan to publish in a few months. We will also ensure that this valuable information is available through our new online repository of good practices, which we will soon launch through our new Connect and Learn platform. Therefore, I would like to reiterate the invitation to share your good practices, lessons learned, case studies, and any tools in any languages with us during and after the expert meeting. We will ensure to make it available through the online repository. And of course, we will ensure that you have the access to that repository to make use of the information that we collect. Dear participants, we are very proud that the first day of the expert meeting brought together over 200 representatives and experts. First of all, we were honored with the opening remarks by United Nations Under-Secretary General for Counter-Terrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, and prominent representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations, Her Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Ali Ahmed bin Saif Al Thani. I would like once again to express appreciation to the State of Qatar for all the support to the global program on the protection of vulnerable targets against terrorist attacks. Without your generous contribution, our today's meeting will not be possible. Our special words of thanks are also to Professor Finuala Newallen, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, for opening the second panel discussion today. Thank you very much for your time and availability. We highly appreciate it. We are very proud that the first day of the expert meeting brought together 9 distinguished panelists on 2 panels and many participants from member states, international and regional organizations, from the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism entities, civil society, academia, the private sector, sport federations, and other stakeholders. And we also had many other colleagues and participants who followed us through the United Nations Web TV. And what is most important, that the recording will remain available to those who were not able to join us today due to other priorities and challenges. So thank you very much for being with us today. Despite many other priorities, we highly value your time and expertise. Without further delay, I will briefly summarize today's discussion of sessions 1 and session 2, because we still have some time, and I know that everyone might be already tired and have some other meetings to join. But if you allow me, I will try to do it very quick to acknowledge the great, valuable, comprehensive presentations by our distinguished speakers. So as you can recall, the session 1 focused on threats posed by US to vulnerable targets. We sincerely appreciate the excellent moderation by our partner and colleague from CITED, Jean-Philippe Morange, who reminded us about the existing Security Council resolutions related to terrorism and how this topic on the threats posed by drones responds to their implementation. CTED colleagues are also developing technical guidelines to facilitate the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2370. These guidelines will also include a subchapter or submodule on drones. Panel 1 also saw in-depth presentation by 4 distinguished speakers. Ms. Cox presented a comprehensive approach of the United Kingdom to addressing the use of drones. Key elements highlighted by Ms. Cox include the need for mitigation, importance for regulation and legislation, as well as understanding of risks and industry engagement. Developing response plans which synchronize procedures and engage all relevant stakeholders is certainly a key element, but also challenging at the same time. The next panelist, Mr. Lefouer from ICAO, delivered an in-depth presentation on their approach and highlighted the importance of integration of this new technology of UAS to the civil aviation industry and its regulation, and the steps done by the organization in this direction. Especially interesting was the presentation of ICAO's risk assessment approach with elements of likelihood, consequences, vulnerability as related to the threats posed by UAS. Mr. Oliveira Martinez from the Peace Research Institute Oslo shared with us insights on the nature of the drone threat, the technological means to respond to it, and the psychological, human rights, and regulatory challenges associated with it. Finally, senior UNOCT consultant, Mr. Gunther Povodan, made a comprehensive presentation on the CBRN attacks on vulnerable targets with the use of drones, which is certainly one of the challenges and threats to public places and critical infrastructure. And of course, there was some discussion about the list of the dual-use technology and how it is related to the drone and other evolving technologies, and about the regulation framework to control and manage the legitimate use of drones on which ICAO has the lead. So then we had the pleasure to listen to the presentation during the session 2. The second panel features case studies and discussed the associated challenges and lessons learned. We sincerely appreciate the excellent moderation by our colleague, Mr. Mendoza, who is also, Fernandez, our dear colleague at UNOCT, who made a brief presentation of our partner global counter-terrorism program on the UAS. And of course, we are implementing and organizing today's event jointly with colleagues at UNOCT and UNOCT, who are leading the global counter-terrorism program on drones. I would like, there was also the invitation by Fernando to reply to the survey, and I would like to reiterate his invitation to participate in this survey initiated by UNCCT colleagues. The program has a very strong focus on human rights implications on the use of drones for counter-terrorism. And in this context, also, I would like to especially highlight and sincerely thank once again Professor New Allen, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Terrorism. Professor highlighted a number of crucial elements, such as human rights concerns associated with the use of drones, states' international human rights obligations in the context of the use of drones by law enforcement, as well as impact of the use of UAS on human rights, including rights to life, privacy, and freedoms of expression and association. Among key takeaways is the importance of safeguards, early planning, and that states should ensure that they do not facilitate the unlawful use of military drones by other parties which might violate human rights using those technologies. Panel 2 also features excellent presentation, but several good excellent presentation of several good practices at the national and regional levels, as well as a contribution by the University of Malaga. Mr. Lee Peng Yang from Singapore shared Singapore's national approach with its 3 major pillars to the UAS. They include legislation and regulatory framework, enforcement efforts to deter non-compliance, and of course a strong emphasis on public education to promote the responsible use of drones. Mr. De Kuber from Belgium shared with us the European regional approach and presented the European program on countering UAS system testing, the project called Courageous. Then we all had the pleasure to listen to the very detailed presentation by Mr. Rassler from the US Military Academy, who provided an excellent overview of the Islamic State's drone program and outlined 5 focus areas where armed non-state actors and terrorist groups have placed historical, operational, drone emphasis, which include the use of drones to deliver chemical and biological weapons, for cross-border missions, and for weaponization of drones. Finally, Mr. Godoy Rubio from the University of Malaga in Spain highlighted challenges of the drone use and how to overcome those obstacles through its unique software platform with a command and control center. This unique approach and the unique capability of the University of Malaga could be applied for many purposes, including the protection of vulnerable targets. And finally, I would like also to stress that many panelists mentioned the importance of the engagement of civil society and to apply a whole of society approach when addressing and finding the solutions and discussing the challenges on the use of drones for in the counter-terrorism context. And the presentation and the participation by our great colleagues from the University of Malaga, where actually in Spain, the university office which leads the implementation of the Vulnerable Targets program is now based. So I have the pleasure to be in Spain, and thank you so much to the University of Malaga for such a great and detailed presentation today. So I'm concluding, I'm finishing, just another 2 minutes about tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll start again at 8 a.m. New York time with day 2. The day 2 will start with the presentation of the global program on vulnerable targets. The first panel discussion will focus on the use of drones to protect vulnerable targets, and we believe that our expert meeting will not be complete without another positive aspect of this technology, which can be used to protect soft targets and critical infrastructure. And the second session will discuss a multidimensional response to UAS-related threats, which was partly covered in the presentation of our distinguished panelists today. In concluding, I wish to express appreciation to our interpreters and technicians for making today's virtual meeting possible. Thank you so much for your patience and for the excellent service provided today. Thank you to all of you for invaluable contributions and everyone who followed us through Zoom or through the UN Web TV. I think we have in-depth and substantive discussion on day 2 of the expert meeting. Have the great rest of the day. The meeting has adjourned. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And we hope that we will also have an in-person expert group meetings in the near future. Thank you.